Okay, well, so thank you for inviting me. The topic of my discussion is the ongoing military operation COVID that has never stopped. Unfortunately, a lot of people are under the impression that it has stopped, that we're post-COVID now and we're post this phase, and now everything is back to normal, and it's completely not true. The same agenda continues uninterrupted, and so I'm hoping to bring this as a collection of evidence to your attention. And some of this probably for many people here will be familiar, but I'm just summarizing just in case the listeners or somebody here doesn't remember, or future listeners of this video. So I'm just going to briefly summarize the entire thing and what my perspective is as far as Trump 2.0 administration doing about it, which is frankly not much. The overall, the goal of this COVID plan and exercise that started, well, visibly started in 2020, but obviously was being prepared over a long period of time, approximately 20 years. We can definitely, in retrospect, see decades of predictive programming of the masses to be afraid of pandemics, to first of all believe that pandemics exist, second of all be afraid of them, third be afraid of naturally evolving viruses jumping from some jungle monkey, which is very portrayed in numerous films from Hollywood, such as Outbreak and Contagion. And then subsequently to that, believe in these whole gain-of-function bioterrorism initiated, again, pandemics that can wipe out. And usually these narratives are such that, something leaks from some lab somewhere and wipes out half the world. All of this is fiction. These things don't exist, never existed. There's no evidence of them existing, even though the so-called GOF viruses leak from labs every other day in the United States. The CDC reports approximately, over 200 leaks from various sorts of biolabs a year. And we have never had a pandemic until one was announced in 2020. Now, the event 201 from Johns Hopkins, obviously everyone cites it, but in addition to it, there were approximately 20 other practice runs and planning coordination exercises for pandemic preparedness, what I call them criminal cartel. It's a hybrid of government and private and military mafia running the world today. There have been, so both me and Catherine Watt, my colleague, have traced very extensive legal history, and while she traced several centuries of history, of relevant history, I can point specifically to the laws that have been enabled and modified and adapted since 2005 to enable mass murder under pretenses of public health and pandemics absolutely legally, with no accountability and no liability whatsoever for those who participate in it knowingly or unknowingly. And that's all pretty much the key piece of law governing all that is PrEP Act. I'll talk about it a little bit more. The Department of Defense-led consortia of pandemic preparedness consist hundreds of from academic institutions, private companies, working, participating in it. Obviously, all of them are tied in confidentiality agreements and contractual obligations, and thus captured. The government promises them grants and sometimes gives them grants, gives grants to preferred entities, but everyone is captured by these consortia. So they're all aligned with the DoD and this private mafia objectives. And of course, all of this is supported by funding. Since the early 2000s, 2005, the funding has been first in millions, then in billions, and since 2020, it became trillions of dollars pumped into this criminal mafia structure to enable, first of all, and enforce and provide incentives for everyone to comply, and very big disincentives for not complying, including propaganda, spying, censorship, persecution of dissent, lawfare, and so forth. And I'm sure many people here have been victims of this. And of course, we know how all of this played out and continues to play out. Now, just to briefly cover this whole idea of pandemics, even if you believe that viruses exist. I don't take a particular position on that issue. I can deal with, it doesn't trigger me, and I can deal with either parties who believe or don't believe. I'm saying that belief is your personal belief. As far as factual data, this is everything that the G20 countries believe to be major outbreaks in the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, actually last 25 years. Well, the COVID isn't excluded from it, by leading to 2020, this was the entire data set of everything that was identified as a pandemic. And as you can see, this is just a joke, obviously, because it accounts for approximately 0% of global annual mortality. And it kind of boggles imagination as to how this can be justified as an existential threat that requires so much coordination, international coordination, trillions of dollars pumped into all these organizations, all these military structures, the extrajudicial structures, WEF, WHO, everything. Why are we supposed to worry about this when traffic accidents account for way more mortality per year? And there are many other issues that need to be addressed with respect to public health. This seems to be a very minor thing to be worried about. Yet we see this enormous structure being built over decades to really, make sure that everybody feels that this is an important issue. Well, clearly it's not. Now, as far as how the COVID crime was committed and by this cartel, there are several key pieces of legislation and agencies that are involved here. So we call it pseudo-legal structure. So they made it on paper legal. All of this is on paper legal, but of course it violates Constitution in numerous ways, and obviously violates every natural law that says that the government doesn't have the right to kill the people. Yet the government explicitly enabled itself to do so using this structure. So the state of war is announced by announcing a public health emergency. What to date, very few people still understand, even on our health freedom dissenting side, very few people understand that there is no justification required for announcing a public health emergency or a pandemic. None. No data is needed. So you don't even need this. None of this is required. You just the pandemics are simply announced by either head of HHS or head of DHS or head of DOD or all of them combined. So they're just announced by this one appointed public health or state official, and they require no justification as far as there being any virus in existence, or being any deaths, or be any morbidity, any illness, or any economic impact. No justification is required for it. They simply write a memo saying, I believe there is a pandemic or a potential for a pandemic. And that's sufficient to announce a public health emergency. Same applies to the public health emergency of international concern announced by WHO, same exact thing. And same exact thing applies to every minister of health out there in any other country outside of US. They have exactly the same laws on the books now that they can announce these things, and it requires no justification. Now, just the act of doing that already suspends the constitutional governance in the United States, collapses all the executive powers into the hands of whoever announced this, HHS or DHS or DOD, collapses all the governance into the executive branch, preempts congressional review, so preempts legislative branch, and preempts judicial branch. And same, it's identical to announcing a war on US soil. So that's the significance of this announcement. That announcement was made initially by Alex Azar, and it was made retroactive to February 4th, 2020. I will discuss why. The announcement has been extended 11 times, most recently under Javier Becerra, outgoing HHS secretary in the United States, and it remains extended today and supposed to last until end of 2029. So we now have a decade of a pandemic and a public health emergency and suspended constitution, courtesy of this event. Now, after they announced this pandemic, the DoD purchased weapons through the same mechanism they always use to purchase weapons, which is other transaction authority, which is a secretive mechanism that they use to buy conventional weapons. They used exactly the same thing. It also allows no bid contracts, allows a huge amount of fraud, money laundering, and covering everything up. And so that's how they bought all these EUA countermeasures, which include vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics and all sorts of things, and services, propaganda, censorship, spying. So trillions of dollars went through this method to fund, as I said, the criminal enterprise. And by the way, pandemic is an enterprise. In the United States, we have officially pandemic enterprise, which consists, it's a quasi-government entity, consists of 11 executive agents, branch agencies, a whole bunch of private contractors. It's a mechanism to appropriate taxpayers' dollars into this secretive, no accountability process, launder it, and privatize to themselves. That's what they're doing. Now, they also use a very important piece of law, which is PrEP Act, which I mentioned, which is a liability shield for all of this. The PrEP Act was introduced in 2005 as part of a military appropriations bill. It was marketed not as law, but it actually is a huge piece of legislation. At the time of its introduction, which was over the weekend on Christmas in the middle of the night, stuck into a multi-thousand page bill, obviously, even though the Democrats mobilized themselves and issued a very scathing set of objections, including a very well-written legal document, legal memo from Edwin Chemerinsky, discussing how this PrEP Act violates U.S. Constitution and numerous amendments to U.S. Constitution, and I completely agree with those objections. They were absolutely correct. Joe Biden spoke very clearly against PrEP Act. So did Hillary Clinton. So did Ted Kennedy and Senator Byrd. And all of their testimonies are available, and they're absolutely correct. I can sign to every word that they said in those objections. And the following day, they all turned around and voted yes for this bill. Well, anyway, so that's kind of the history of it. But they were all speaking against it specifically because it is a license to kill, because it removes any liability for anybody killing or injuring a person with the covered countermeasure as long as the PrEP Act declaration remains in place. So this system that I'm describing here is fully in place today. Nothing changed. It did not go away. It's still there. Trump 1.0 enabled it, Biden continued it, and Trump 2.0 continues to enable it, and they don't even mention it anywhere, that this is an issue, that this needs to be reformed, that this needs to be rolled back or anything. So they're fully on board with this structure because it helps them. Again, as I said, not only, well, we can debate whether the mass killing is intentional. I believe it is. Some people believe it's not, but at the minimum, it enables them to conduct this humongous money laundering operation, profiteering of the deaths and injury that they're causing. My colleague, Debbie Lerman, and I recently published a COVID dossier, and I can't cover it here in detail, but you can read it on my Substack. And this provides extensive evidence of what I've just described as a military operation all over the world using identical or nearly identical legal structures and systems and financial incentives and so forth. And so we've profiled numerous countries, including US, Canada, EU, and even non-EU countries like Switzerland and Turkey, and a bunch of countries in Asia and in Latin America. So we've covered pretty much all the regions of the world, and it's undeniable that this is a military operation everywhere, and it's conducted along the same structures and frameworks. What's important to understand about this, what we're covering in the dossier, there are some key events that are consistently overlooked by everyone, because even, as I said, on the dissenting side, and this is my biggest pet peeve today, is all the dissenting side, majority of the dissenting side, also enables the lies by pretending that this was about public health and that we need to discuss data and evidence and science. Instead, what we're dealing with is criminality, state level driven criminality, and a whole bunch of manipulative and fraudulent laws and unconstitutional laws being utilized for a massive crime. And they started this crime by doing the two things. On February 4th, 2020, there was a declaration of utilizing CBRN, invoking CBRN laws and emergencies. CBRN is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons of mass destruction. And by making these announcements of emergency declarations using the laws that were utilized here, they invoked this framework of CBRN defense, and then also issued simultaneously PrEP Act and EUA declaration. So EUA and PrEP Act, they're basically, once you issue a PrEP Act emergency declaration, automatically all EUAs are also issued for any countermeasures for this declaration. And when PrEP Act emergency declaration was issued in March, it was made retroactive to February 4th, 2020. We didn't know why that particular date and why make it retroactive, but now we know, because the second event that happened on that day was a phone call was placed from DARPA, from Department of Defense, to the pharmaceutical consortium, informing them that the COVID was declared, or COVID virus or COVID was declared as a national security threat, and that they need to switch from their previously, the models that they were previously working on, which were pan influenza, to COVID. And so that phone call was made by Colonel Matt Hepburn of DARPA, and we only learned about it because I received the whistleblower tape where this is discussed by AstraZeneca executives at the end of 2020. And on this tape, so Colonel Matt Hepburn is here on the right, and on the tape that I have, and you can also listen to it on my Substack. I have recording between Pascal Soro and Mark Esser from AstraZeneca talking about the history of how they were approached by the DoD to participate in this consortium in 2017, and then received that phone call on February 2020. And also, interestingly, at the time when they were approached by Matt Hepburn in 2017, Mark Esser said, I thought it was science fiction what they were pitching, which is, the DoD will identify viruses of pandemic potential, and then pharma companies will be making vaccines and therapeutics for them within 60 days. And Mark Esser said that's nonsense, and it is nonsense, because you can't do that. Can't do either. You can't identify a virus with pandemic potential before actual illness and death, and you can tally them up and compare to previous years. Here they were saying, we'll just, on the computer identify virus with pandemic potential, and you guys will make medicines for that computer virus, right? And then we're gonna jab them all in people within 60 days. So Mark Esser, at that time kind of had a pause about it. But then, of course, a lot of money was offered, and AstraZeneca signed up to this consortium. Now, another interesting event, and these videos are still available on Pentagon website. You can go and watch them as well. So there was a series of press conferences from Operation Warp Speed conducted at the Pentagon throughout 2020. This is I think this is the first one, actually, on March 5th, 2020. At this press event, Colonel Wendy Simmons Jackson says, we have received the pathogen and we're growing it. Okay, now I would like to remind that, on the February 4th or on March 5th, there were really maybe a handful of PCR cases identified, and I don't know, maybe there were one or two deaths, but nothing particularly dangerous was going. Actually, probably were no deaths, but nothing dangerous, no evidence of any pandemic or excess illness or deaths was happening in the United States, meaning that there was no COVID illness in the United States. Yet she says, we're growing the stocks of this pathogen, whatever that is. And it begs the question, why are they proliferating prohibited weapon of mass destruction, which is now, now it's okay to call it a Gulf virus. So it's a prohibited weapon of mass destruction. And on March 5th, she declares that that's precisely what DOD is doing, violating Bioweapons Prohibition Convention. And the data also shows that that's exactly what happened. When the DOD phone call was placed on February 4th, there was nothing. When Wendy Simmons Jackson said they're growing virus, there was nothing. Right after she said that, we have something. So this is basically an announcement of well, you can call it a bioweapons attack. So it was an announcement of an attack from the DOD, and after attack happened, now we have the implementation of this attack. So that's why I'm saying it's not a pandemic, it's not a public health event, it's an attack on people with a variety of weapons, including largely psychological, initially psychological weapons, and subsequently, chemical, biological, and conventional, and killing in hospitals, and killing with poison, and all sorts of things, lockdowns, economical weapons. So the warfare was announced by these announcements from the DOD, and then warfare was implemented, and they continue implementing it on us. What also Debbie Lerman uncovered first, and we covered in our dossier, and she also published a book about this recently, is that in the US, the entity that was in charge of COVID response and COVID policy had nothing to do with public health. It was National Security Council. This wasn't told to the public at all. She accidentally found this document on New York Times website somewhere. She's been, since then, she's been trying to FOIA and sue the US government to get additional documentation explaining how this was all justified and put together. And she's gotten absolutely nowhere, despite using high-profile attorneys and trying to get some disclosure here. But so far she has not succeeded. It was all classified, made secret, and National Security Council, which is advisory body to the US president, which consists of military and intelligence heads, was put in charge. And as you can see, this policy of a National Security Council covers weapons of mass destruction, BATS, which is transportation system related, like security measures. So it's covering, I guess, international and domestic travel. And then resilience, which is a very, it's a key word that's used everywhere. Especially with relation to biological weapons manufacturing, which is, and there's even a company now called Resilience, which is a CIA outfit, CIA affiliated outfit with Scott Gottlieb on the board, which is manufacturing majority of the active ingredients for all these shots. Anyway, so as you can see, they were in charge of policy. Then HHS was given only coordinating role. And kind of communications. So HHS is playing being like a front, like spokespeople, pretending that this is a public health event, and they're still pretending it's a public health event. And again, I have a huge pet peeve because our dissenting side also pretends this is a public health event, which is helping this deception. But clearly, a public health event was not in charge. Public health was not in charge of this. They were not allowed to communicate. HHS was initially communicating until Deborah Birx was brought in late February. And after she was brought in, she took over all the policy and all the communications. And while again, everybody thinks it was Fauci, it wasn't Fauci, it was Deborah Birx. And it's very clear, especially if you read Scott Atlas's book, it's very clear that she ran the whole thing. All these nonsensical and deliberately harmful policies, such as lockdowns and masking and all that, came from her. Now, she may be not the author of them, but she was definitely placed by the entity, whoever is running this whole thing. And not even Trump could override her. Nobody could override her. So she was in charge of this, of the policy and communications. So we've seen the same in other countries. So for example, Alberta published this sort of investigation task force report. And in their first chapter, they're describing how they were trying to trace the system of communications in Alberta, and they arrived at the brick wall. So it went up to the national security and state, and at that point, they got completely stonewalled, and they could not figure out who was giving orders, who was in charge of what. And I suspect highly because it's the same system in Canada, it's classified, and it goes somewhere to the equivalent of the NSC in Canada. As far as the Operation Warp Speed, you probably have seen the slide many times. The DoD was the chief operating officer. General Gustav Perna was the chief operating officer, and HHS was only in an advisory role. By the way, both Birx and Gustav Perna are now on board of directors of Palantir, which is kind of this data octopus that's receiving huge amounts of money from Trump administration to create the digital control grid for all Americans to track us and target us for elimination if we're dissenting and not behaving the way they want us to. And now all the upper layer here, executive layer, which is National Security Council, DoD, BARDA, and other defense agencies were in charge of all of this. And only a third layer below is pharma companies. They were suppliers under Defense Production Act. So basically, the government orders them to produce weapons, and they produce weapons, and they get a lot of money, and they shut up. The money was allocated. Again, everything came from the DoD via their Advanced Technology International, which is their contractor, Department of Defense contractor managing various weapons making activities. And in this case, they were also put in charge of this. And there's a full set of contracts so far available. It's not all of the contracts, but a large collection, which is very representative of what's going on here, is available on KEI online website. And I've reviewed a whole bunch of these myself. Now, as I said, we found the same pattern in every country that we've profiled in the COVID dossier, and it basically boils down to not a public health event. CBRN laws invoked worldwide and lasting for a decade now. Health agencies excluded from decisions, while military intelligence agencies are in charge of both decisions and communication, propaganda, censorship, spying. Nonsensical policies, if you think about it as a public health epidemic management, but they make sense in the context of military attack. So this is the policies designed to drive maximum fear, panic, through media, again, censorship, lockdowns, mask mandates. None of this makes any epidemiologic sense or public health sense. There was always a definitely push toward focusing on news from overseas, from things that are far away and cannot be verified, such as these Chinese videos and of people falling in the streets. But everyone on the ground in the public health agencies and people who were maybe genuinely trying to do the right thing, they were told to not focus on the local data. And as you know, epidemiology is always local. It's always what's happening here in your community. Are people sick? Are people dying? Is there economic damage? But here, everything is flipped upside down, and you're supposed to follow what's happening in China, but not follow what's happening in your backyard. Again, nonsensical, deliberately harmful, deceptive. And it makes no sense in public health context, makes a lot of sense if it's a military attack. The military was in charge of all vaccine funding, supply chain, manufacturing, distribution worldwide, national security military laws, and lockstep policies everywhere. Now, as far as vaccines, drugs, tests, and this is true till today. So it never changed. All of them are EUA countermeasures. I constantly have arguments. Even like one, I was responding to emails before I got on this call with very high profile, these sort of freedom leaders who are all telling me, oh, this new MX next spike was fully approved by the FDA. It's nonsense. All of them are EUA countermeasures until the PrEP Act declaration is terminated. There is no such thing as fully approving an EUA countermeasure, and I'll cover exactly why. EUA countermeasures are by law excluded from any pharmaceutical regulation. No pharmaceutical regulations apply to them at all. In fact, they explicitly, everything that's illegal for pharmaceuticals is made legal for EUA countermeasures. Again, until the PrEP Act declaration is extended. And there is no manufacturer's liability whatsoever. So you can never equate these two. You can't say that EUA countermeasures somehow magically got approved until the PrEP Act declaration is removed and it actually goes through the real investigational approval. Now, as far as the short summary of what EUA countermeasures are, in the US, COVID-19 injections marketed as vaccines reached commercial market as EUA countermeasures under public health emergency. And they remain so because, as I said, the declaration has been extended until 2029. Based on this EUA status, they cannot be used as investigational products. That's very explicit in the US law. And because it's non-investigational, there's no applicability of an investigational review board, no informed consent rules, and they're not subject to any evidentiary standards for safety or efficacy. So again, this is a massive, massive deception, including driven by our health freedom leaders who are insisting that we need to finally gather all the safety and efficacy data and definitively prove to every single person, 350 million in the US, that there's this data and science supporting that they're not safe. And only then can RFK Jr. remove them from market. Nothing can be further from the truth. And them saying so promotes this massive deception because again, US law is explicit. There's no evidentiary standards applicable to EUA countermeasures. That's not how they get on the market, not at all. There's only maybe effective opinion of HHS secretary and FDA commissioner that are applicable here. If those guys say yes, they go on the market. If they say no, they get off the market. So I just described to you how we can remove them from the market very quickly. And despite being described as investigational products in Pfizer's SEC reports, they're actually legally not. So Pfizer is even lying in SEC reports, but nobody is holding them accountable for that. And they cannot meet the standards that everyone expects from them. And because there is absence of true and enforceable consumer safeguards in relation to these products, they are potential poisons. Well, they should be treated as poisons by default because that's how all drugs are treated. If you don't know what's in the syringe, don't pick it up and don't stick it in yourself, right? That's very common sense, and that's how all the laws are written, except when it's an EUA countermeasure, then that doesn't apply anymore. So they remain in circulation and they remain as de facto poisons, wrapped in a whole bunch of lies by both sides, by the way. And so this is a pretty complicated slide, but it just gives you references to everything I just said about EUA countermeasures. In the US, there are two categories of how chemical substances can get on the consumer market. One is what everybody expects and thinks about when we talk about this issue, which is on the left-hand side, which is FDA normal regulatory pathways. The very, very important part here is legally a chemical substance first needs to be designated as investigational. That's the first step. If it's not designated as investigational, it goes into this other bucket on the right-hand side, which says HHS declared public health emergency. Under this declaration, these EUA countermeasures are governed by Chapter 564 of Food and Drugs and Cosmetics Act, which is, as I said, makes everything that's illegal for these things on the left fully legal for the things on the right. You don't need to have IRB. Informed consent doesn't apply. Maybe effective criteria is all that's needed to go on the market. There's no enforcement by the FDA. Clinical trials are not possible, or let's say legal human subject protected clinical trials are not possible because of the absence of IRB and informed consent. And they can coexist with fully approved versions from the FDA. And also lying about them is fully legal as well. And now this is so that you don't think that I imagined all this. This is a slide from FDA themselves, from their lawyers. There's a PowerPoint that the lawyers prepared explaining the subject of countermeasures and EUA, and this is a slide directly from them. And so that just confirms what I described. If DoD secretary or DHS secretary or HHS secretary announces a public health emergency or some sort of emergency, then the structure is triggered into place. In this case, HHS secretary puts into a Federal Register declaration that he thinks that there is circumstances exist justifying public health emergency declaration. And then after that, he asks FDA commissioner to issue EUA. That's it, nothing else. There's no clinical trial data. There's no box that says, and then you conduct clinical trials and then EUA is issued. No, HHS secretary declares pandemic, asks FDA commissioner issues. That's all. This is the entire regulatory pathway of how these things get on the market. And this is exactly how this mNEX spike that was just approved, last week, that's also how it got on the market. Despite of them running some sort of a study, that study is irrelevant to this decision. Again, Pfizer's study was irrelevant to this decision. In fact, Brooke Jackson has been litigating against Pfizer since 2021. And the courts unanimously confirmed what I'm just saying, that clinical trial data and fraud thereof had no impact whatsoever for issuing EUA authorizations and paying Pfizer for their contracts. And the courts are very, very clear about it. So all of this lasts until emergency declaration and EUAs are terminated, again, by those two people, HHS secretary and FDA commissioner. And this is another citation from the law, just to point out that here that we have this under number 2, the effect of all of this, of these EUA countermeasure stuff, is that the EUA countermeasures shall not be deemed adulterated or misbranded. This is the part that says you can have any ingredients, anything there. It doesn't have to be disclosed on the label, doesn't have to comply with the label in any way, and there's no enforcement of the label. And there's also no enforcement of marketing claims, any sort of advertising or promotion claims made about these products. And that's why I'm saying lying is legal about this. So the administration today is lying about them, but they're not breaking the law. They're allowed to do that. And this is another verification of what I said as far as these products being EUAs. This is a testimony by Doran Fink at FDA meeting, and that's when he said by October 2020, Operation Warp Speed switched to non-investigational EUA pathway, because specifically he cites here the reasons for switching was because they didn't want to be burdened by IRB and informed consent requirements. It would slow them down. So that's how he justified that they switched by October 2020. But since October 2020, all of these products have been EUA countermeasures. No legal standards apply to them. And so, as I said, in summary, this BLA approval is essentially a hoax on the public. They were ordered as prototypes and demonstrations in DoD contracts. Clinical trials were not ordered, but they're legally not possible because of the non-investigational status. The CGXP compliance is not possible to enforce, again, because of the EUA countermeasure status. And people are deceived into illegal medical experiment. You can't even call it a medical experiment. It's an illegal medical experiment with no informed consent. And just a note for EU and other countries that don't have PrEP Act, I call it a synthetic PrEP Act, because using different other laws and deception, they've implemented net effect of the same as PrEP Act in the US through a bait and switch strategy. So specifically, a bunch of emails were leaked from European Medicines Agency at the end of 2020. And as part of these emails, it became clear that Ursula von der Leyen conducted this bait and switch operation in the EU. So she first promised to all the member states that the EU is going to run a conditional marketing approval process for these products, for vaccines, and that is in theory, a strict way to enforce, a more or less strict way to enforce pharmaceutical regulations. So the member states signed up, and here it even says that she was personally, arm twisting them to not go with the Article 5.2, which is emergency use authorization issued by each member state individually, and so can be revoked by each member state individually, but promising them that EU will implement a much more rigorous process. So they signed up to this. Now, in theory, as I said, the Article 5.2, which is emergency use authorization, seems like a weaker mechanism because it's only emergency authorized, and the waives liability, but it's authorized by a year, and each member state can revoke it independently of EU. However, she pushed them all into single pact, promising the CMA protections. And so they delegated this authority to EU, and then she turned around and had them sign the contracts that waived all of those restrictions and rigorous standards of approval from CMA. So she basically, it's kind of like, I don't know what to compare it to, but like a cat in a bag. So she said, oh, it's going to be CMA, but turns out it was just blind sign off to waive all the applicable controls, liability, and even further waive the national ability to change the laws with respect to product liability in their countries, and even requiring the states to put up state assets as collateral for identification of Pfizer and other manufacturers. So that's how this net effect of PrEP Act was achieved in the EU. And so finally, I have a couple of slides on what I think of current Trump 2.0 and Maha administration. And, so my opinion of them is fairly bleak at the moment. I'll explain why. So when I first heard of this Maha policy, it was published in Wall Street Journal in September 2024. I read it, and it immediately became apparent to me that this is a total subversion of the health freedom agenda and health freedom campaign promises. It was authored by Kelly Means, who was parachuted out of seemingly nowhere, but he comes from illustrious family of Grady Means, who was a longtime staffer to Nelson Rockefeller and a very well-known globalist with very deep connections to the deep state. So it's as deep state as it gets, this family. And interestingly, well, so Debbie Lerman wrote a series of articles about them, mind-blowing. I highly recommend. And that whole family is just a very interesting situation. So this Kelly Means shows up out of nowhere, former farmer lobbyist, born again health freedom fighter. And he starts writing this, wrote this Maha policy, which is basically just, I call it anything but vaccines, ABV policy. It's designed to dilute, drown in irrelevant items and distract attention from vaccines in general, and specifically from mRNA vaccines, as the main driver of chronic illness and death worldwide. And they have been, consistent in pushing this policy on everyone and pretending like, oh, well, you have to be holistic. You have to look at every cause of chronic illness, such as, titanium dioxide in Skittles and Fruit Loops and things like that. So that's been going on there. Now, in the first 5 months of Trump 2.0, what we have is a PrEP Act declaration that was extended by Javier Becerra. It remains in place up until end of 2029. Maha Commission report was issued, and turns out it's written by AI. It has fake citations. It has practically nothing about vaccines at all. I mean, there's like one paragraph at the end and mentioning something, but nothing that ties them to chronic disease or anything like that. And distracts into very minor issues, into food. They're aggressively, looks like they're aggressively going after food and agriculture to regulate the hell out of it, which only leads one place. It's like more government control, fewer small farms, and things like that. Then there's this new FDA COVID shot policy was published also a couple of weeks ago by Commissioner Makary and CBER head Prasad, claiming that it's their new, brand new MAHA policy, but turns out it's actually a policy that was developed under Biden administration in 2022 or 2023. Exactly the same, and evidence of that is the approval of this mNEX spike by Moderna, because it's fully compliant with this policy. But the study for mNEX spike was initiated in 2023. So how did they know that this is going to be acceptable in 25? Well, because they were told by the FDA, by Califf and Peter Marks, that this is going to be acceptable. I will talk about the policy in more detail. There's on the horizon self-amplifying mRNA by a company called Arcturus. It's already approved in the EU and in Japan, and it's currently running a study in the US and will be approved in the US this fall. And it will be approved because, as I said, there's FDA can do nothing about it. The EUAs are already authorized and have been since 2020. Well, actually, sorry, in case of Arcturus, it's for bird flu, but there is an EUA for and public health emergency declaration for bird flu as well. And additional COVID shots in development are also fast-tracked. There are inhaled and oral versions being developed by different other companies and funded by BARDA and HHS. There's 500 million funding from HHS for universal flu vax was authorized as well. And now Commissioner Makary is embarking on a listening tour of pharma companies, but he, for some reason, does not want to hear from vaccine victims and people and families of people who were killed in hospitals with COVID murder protocol. How wonderful. And then, of course, the Deborah Birx and General Perna are on the board of Palantir, which was awarded around $1 billion for military and civilian digital control grid, targeting individual citizens with military precision using a variety of data sets such as social media, social security, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance data, movement data, purchasing data, stuff like that. So combining it all together and coming up with targets for surveillance, imprisonment, elimination, lawfare, any sort of suppression activities, you name it. It's Stasi on steroids, now with new technology. Now let's look briefly at this new FDA policy by Commissioner Makary and Prasad. And so this was published in New England Journal of Medicine. They're the lead authors there. And they're claiming that this is somehow limiting, a breakthrough. We're going to limit COVID shots, mRNA vaccines only for so-called vulnerable individuals. I have huge both philosophical, moral, and practical objections to it. From medical and epidemiologic standpoint, it makes no sense. I'll explain why. So they're saying here that all new COVID vaccines will be approved without placebo control studies and without long-term safety monitoring. And this is exactly how this mNEX spike came on the market, through the same study. So no placebo control, no long-term safety monitoring. The shots get approved and they immediately become available to anyone over 65 years of age, regardless of health status. And then in addition to that, a category of so-called vulnerable, which is specified here on the left. And you can see, it's small text, but you can get I'll give you the PowerPoint later. And these categories make no sense whatsoever because, for example, it includes all pregnant and breastfeeding women. So all women, all pregnancy and recent pregnancy, in opinion of Drs. Makary and Prasad, makes you vulnerable, immunocompromised, and thus you will automatically benefit from new version of mRNA shot that has not been tested for safety at all and has never been tested for safety in pregnancy. And actually the current label says so, that there's no data to justify its use in pregnancy. But yet here they're recommending it to all pregnant women and all women who were recently pregnant. In addition to that, they have different other categories, such as people with cardiovascular diseases, people with HIV, with cancer, mental health, smoking, even though we know smoking was protective from COVID. So why is smokers vulnerable here again? I don't understand. Then, all kinds of other asthma, if you're overweight, or if you have a sedentary lifestyle. So if you're couch potato, you're also vulnerable here. And you need this shot right away, right when it becomes available, first thing. Now, then, of course, they're saying, well, and then FDA recommends post-marketing, like real clinical trials, placebo-controlled trials, for with focus on people 50 to 64 years old, and then sponsor-driven, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. Also, sponsor-driven means that if the pharma company feels like it, then they'll do it. But there's no enforcement from the FDA. And frankly, they will never be done. Neither of these will be done because these new strains or new variants are announced every 6 months or so, and the changeover of the strains and variants is happening much faster than any company can do any study like this. So they will not be done, and obviously FDA has no plans to enforce them, and legally they cannot enforce them. So, also interestingly, I'm just discussing this category of how they determine the vulnerable. And here I'm showing on 3 different slides of how they perfectly, these vulnerable categories perfectly match to people who were specifically excluded from the original mRNA clinical trials and excluded from all other clinical trials that have been, or pretend clinical trials that have been done for these products, as you can see. So they map to these categories perfectly. So exclusion criteria maps to categories that then Prasad and Markary are saying vulnerable, and thus require the shots that have never been tested for anything because the people were excluded from it. So it's this continuous loop of this nonsense going on, right? And then that's the 3rd slide showing it. So finally, CDC sat on it for a little bit, and then they updated their recommendations, which is still a Byzantine structure. If you go look on their website, on CDC website, and try to figure this out. I tried, and so my conclusion to date. So what they said in their updated recommendations, at least for children, I was looking at the children's one. They said that they recommend these shots to children who are defined as vulnerable, so defined as moderately immunocompromised. Under this definition, moderately immunocompromised, at least 75% of US population will qualify for it, and a large percentage, maybe 65% of children will qualify for it. There is no evidence that mRNA shots are beneficial for anyone with those compromised immune conditions and all those categories that are listed there. For example, there are current warnings for myocarditis, pericarditis on the label of these shots, yet they are recommended to people with cardiovascular disease. So how does this make any medical or epidemiologic sense? It doesn't. Then, smokers we already covered. For pregnancy, we already covered. We know that mRNA is clearly at least associated with cancer. I can say definitively it causes cancer, but okay, fine, if you're fighting me on this, associated with cancer. So how can you recommend this to cancer patients with a straight face? Same with the HIV, because we know that it itself compromises immune system, produces more, vaccine-enhanced disease, so produces additional bouts of COVID where, due to the vaccination. So again, why are you making the recommendation for people with lowered immune function? And in addition, nobody speaks about the huge financial incentives. So even if CDC is honest and says, well, we don't recommend it to healthy people or healthy children, what happens in practice, a person comes into a doctor's office, or parents with child come to a doctor's office, the doctor has humongous financial incentives to inject. So all of the incentives, and especially if you talk about, highly populated states like California, New York, Massachusetts, you go to any medical encounter, all of them have bounty on your head if they inject you. So all of them are now have incentive to manipulate you verbally into thinking that you're immunocompromised and thus would benefit from this, because the money is attached to it. And if they don't do that, they have administrative punishments, up to revoking their licenses, throwing them out of the system. So of course the whole system is designed in such a way that at every encounter, and by the way, CDC also claims that it's a shared decision making. So they're saying, well, yeah, we don't recommend it, but it's your shared decision making with the healthcare provider. And they define the healthcare provider as anyone under the sun, basically not just your doctor, but also a pharmacist who has never seen you or your child, has no idea about your file. And most of the time, these people rotate through pharmacies who it's just a clerk in the pharmacy. But that somehow you're supposed to, as a parent, share your decision about injecting your child with mRNA with that random person from the grocery store. And again, a random person from the grocery store has financial incentives to inject your child. So none of this is being discussed nowhere in a policy. Recently, my colleagues and I we issued an open letter to RFK Jr. just describing this and our dissatisfaction with not meeting campaign promises and not doing anything to remove these shots from market.